would like to welcome you to this symposium on behalf of Christian-Jewish Dialogue of Toronto, the Faculty of Theology at the University of St. Michael's College, and Massey College. Thank you for being here. My name is Barbara Borax. I'm the Executive Director of Christian-Jewish Dialogue of Toronto. I wish to acknowledge this land on which we are meeting. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank the sponsors of the symposium, the Metcalfe Foundation, the Office of Ecumenical and Interfaith Affairs for the Archdiocese of Toronto, Metropolitan United Church, the Islamic Society of North America, the Dominican Institute of Toronto, Basic Income Canada Network, Canadian Council of Muslim Women, Toronto Area Interfaith Council, Yonge Street Mission, Toronto Board of Rabbis, and the Intercultural Dialogue Institute. I would also like to introduce Father Damien McPherson. Where is he? Right there. Who is very much the heart and soul of this project. The purpose of this symposium is to consider the importance of identifying a set of values and principles that can inform the development of a basic income model. The importance of doing this should not be underestimated. During the next few years, there will be many discussions, emotional debates, and proposals about the issue of a basic income. We need to ensure that these discussions remain focused on building a system grounded on the principles of human dignity, mutual respect, and security. I'd like to give you a very brief history on how the symposium developed. The CJDT was established in 1974. It was the first formally established interfaith organization in Canada. It broke new ground. Over the past 6 years, and currently with Rabbi David Seed as chair, David, there you go, right there. The board of CJDT has been working to break new ground again, and this symposium is the result. Today in this room, we have representatives from faith, labor, health, agriculture, business, social policy, political leadership from all 3 levels of government, academic specialists, NGOs, and foundations. We are all here because we recognize that the fundamental values of dignity and respect need to guide the mechanics of a basic income system, a system which, if implemented properly, will play a significant role in addressing the issue of poverty in Canada. It won't be easy, but if we keep our eyes focused on the goal, we just might be able to do it. It really should be easier than sending a man to the moon, and that happened, 40 years ago? The organizing for this symposium began when the board of CJDT brought together Muslim, Jewish, United Church, Roman Catholic, Evangelical, Indigenous, and Hindu representatives and asked, "Will you support the Basic Income Initiative project?" The answer was unanimous, and it was yes. I'd like to now answer a question I've heard many times. What do faith-based organizations bring to the table in discussions of basic income? I will limit my answer to 2 reasons. One is practical and one is historical. First, the practical. Faith-based organizations have always been at the forefront of supporting the poor and the marginalized. Today in this room, we have Bruce Rivers from Covenant House, Dennis Costello from Catholic Family Services, Angie Haynes from EcuHome, Liz Shelton from Yonge Street Mission, Michael Fullen from the Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Toronto, and Pervez Nassim from the Islamic Society of North America. In addition, churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues provide so much of the help and support for those who frequently have nowhere else to go. Reverend John Joseph Mastandrea from Metropolitan United Church knows this all too well. But there is another lesson that faith-based organizations can teach us all: the historical memory of what happens when we forget our guiding values and principles and focus our actions on our own narrow constituencies and short-term situational agendas. When we forget that we are all neighbors and we are all part of a bigger world. When we forget that human dignity should be for all people and not just those we deem worthy. Earlier, I thanked you all for being here. I would like to go one step further and commend you all for being here. You all accepted an invitation from a small, faith-based organization. This project is a leap of faith for all of us. By being here today, we have taken the first step in saying we need to work together. We need to recognize other institutions and people have valid and important experiences to bring to the table. We recognize that human dignity and self-respect should never be an afterthought. So I am somewhat of a newbie when it comes to basic income, the issues surrounding basic income, but I've had some very remarkable teachers guiding me through its complexities. And I would now like to introduce one of them to the podium, the Honorable Hugh Segal.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the organizers who made today possible. It is a vital and important opportunity for men and women of good faith and a spirit of interfaith engagement to focus on poverty, its scourge, its real costs, its cruelty, and what a rational and civilized remediation of poverty might be within the spirit of a society of compassion, practicality, and engagement. 32 years ago, the Royal Commission on Canada's Economic Prospects recommended free trade. It was chaired by the Honourable Donald S. MacDonald, MP for Rosedale, here in Toronto. He was appointed by Prime Minister Trudeau, but at the vagaries of Canadian political life, his report was received by Prime Minister Mulroney. That recommendation was accepted for free trade by the Mulroney government, and free trade negotiations were started with the Reagan administration. In 1988, an election was fought on the issue after the agreement had been reached. The pro-free trade progressive Conservatives were returned with a majority, and the agreement was put into effect, generating billions in exports, cross-border commerce, and new patterns of trade and investment. It was a good agreement for both countries, maximizing what was then the largest trading relationship in the world. But it didn't bring good news to everybody. That same MacDonald Royal Commission on our economic prospects recommended a guaranteed annual income in order to stabilize the circumstances for men and women in the workforce as the transitions caused by freer trade agreements took hold. Sadly, that recommendation was rejected by an advisory committee on industrial transition headed by a prominent Montreal business leader who may have meant well, but simply was wrong. He said that what was then called unemployment insurance was all that we needed to manage the transition for peoples whose lives might be affected by free trade. A few years later, after accepting that recommendation, the Tories cut unemployment insurance. And then the subsequent Liberal government cut it even worse. The minister who made that cut, Doug Young, lost his seat in the Maritimes with about 17 other Liberals as a result of that decision. But the end result of those cuts was a whole bunch of people who should have been sustained were thrown into the welfare system. And the welfare system doesn't encourage work, and in no Canadian province does it give people enough to live at, near, or above the poverty line. That's what we inherited from all of that. That's where we now sit here as we gathered this morning. While extremism, protectionism, excessive populist nationalism, religious intolerance all have their own unique historical and geographically diverse roots, distributional injustice, where only a few benefit from economic trends. The low end of the workforce pays disproportionately high prices in terms of income insecurity and collapse. And the great middle not only makes no gains, but runs out of evidence-based hope, also contributes to the tensions that feed those negative forces I referenced a moment ago. Those are the very tensions that extreme nationalists, divisive purveyors of hate, those who seek division, narrowing perspective, count upon very much. Mistakes made decades ago left 40% of folks who are out of work in this country ineligible for employment insurance. 40%. This forced many into welfare, which is not in any way adequate with respect to what people need to live lives of self-respect and some measure of optimism and hope. We are here today because as people of faith, we believe leaving folks behind through political and economic sins of omission or commission makes little sense. People of different faiths, no faith, some faith, working together in good faith, can help governments at all levels keep the faith in support of a genuine society of equality of opportunity for all. No government, however rich, right, left, center, should ever try to ensure equality of outcomes. Certainly not in an open and free society where people have to have the right to make their own choices. But no government should be allowed to desert its obligation on all of our behalf to leave no stone unturned in support of equality of opportunity. As you may know, the Ontario government last spring committed itself to a pilot project to test how a new basic income in Ontario might improve the situation of Ontarians who either live off welfare or disability support and who are part of the thousands of Ontarians who work but are also beneath the poverty line. As we sit here this morning, 15% of Ontarians live under the low-income measure that defines relative poverty in our province. The percentage for our First Nations brothers and sisters is far worse. I give much credit to the Ontario government, Premier, and ministers for looking for a better way. And I'm honoured to have prepared a discussion paper at the province's request to help with the consultation process the province will soon launch basic income pilot as it promised several months ago. I'm not sure how that process will go. I do know that the consultation process will be open to all Ontarians. The province is committed to launching the pilot before the end of the fiscal year we are now in. The Government of Ontario deserves great credit, in my judgment, for all of this. What happens in the consultative process, how the communities in this room, the different denominations in this room, and the millions of Ontarians you represent and on whose behalf you work, how they engage in that process is in part what I hope you will discuss here today. Quite aside from whatever matters of different theology, belief, or observance may differentiate between us and the different religions and faiths in our society, there is a core theme to all our faiths that is compelling. Families, young people, people in economic difficulty, people who have physical or mental disadvantages, always have the right to hope. And our collective responsibility is to sustain that hope, to put evidence in the marketplace that encourages that hope, because the hope should never be a waste of time. Free, non-police state societies operate on the mutual relationship between hope and trust. Without one, you cannot have the other. And without both, no society can survive. Saying that the poor are always with us is a profoundly discriminatory and complacent thing to say, and I reject it completely. And it violates who we are as Canadians, and why so many millions have come here from around the world for hundreds of years. Turning our back on the 3 million plus residents of Canada who now live in poverty is akin to turning our back on the equivalent of all of British Columbia, or Saskatchewan and Manitoba, or all of the Maritimes. We are all here today, I think, because we do not think our country, our respective faiths, our common bond with each other, has room for what I would call poverty complacency, a different preference for the term PC. Poverty complacency. Poverty complacency accepts inequality of opportunity, the ravages of bad health, food insecurity, unfit housing, bad educational outcome, measures of trouble with the law, lower lifespans for 1 in 7 Ontarians. I recall no election where any political party promised those outcomes as part of their policy. I know of no political party who would dare to try that. I don't recall any political meeting where those policy options were suggested as the right way ahead. But that is the context in which we find ourselves if we do not find a better way to proceed. I know of the faith in our ability to work together, with and without denomination in this room, and I'm honored to be part of it. I'm delighted to have been asked to be here. I look forward to working with you and with the effort reflected by those in this room for many, many months and years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugh. It's my pleasure now to introduce the next couple of speakers. I would like to invite you to look at your programs to find bios for these illustrious people. I think it's more important that we take the time that they have to share their ideas with us. So read the bios, and I would like you to welcome now David Walsh.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks to Barbara and Sheila and the organizing committee for organizing this diverse group of people from many faith communities. It's really hopeful to see everybody here. I just thought I'd give you a bit of an idea of how I got started as a businessman interested in social justice and social issues. I was doing volunteer work down at a addiction detox center on Dundas West, and there were about 25 men on the ground floor and 25 women upstairs, and so I was working with the men downstairs, really just having conversations with them, and I found it kind of disconcerting that these men would come in and they would just dry out, usually from an alcoholic addiction back then, and be expected to move on where they often had no place to go. And around the same time, I was doing renovations to the Gooder and Flatiron building, which a partner and I had purchased. And so I started asking these guys over to help out. The Flatiron building had been modernized in the 1950s with a new technology called plywood. So they put this plywood over all this beautiful oak wainscoting and pine windows and pine doors. So I got some of these guys working on it, and it ended up, that I had about 10 or 15 of them from this detox center working for about 6 months. And I didn't really know the difference between a detox center and a treatment center and a recovery center back then, or I probably would have had second thoughts. But it was always amazing to me how these guys really put their heart into the work, and they were really reliable. We had a native person who was good at woodwork and really fixed a lot of the damage that had been done by the modernization. And I think that experience sort of led me on to Tent City a few years later with Kathy Crow and the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee. And, we're men and women were trying to get out of the shelter system and trying to go down and set up something different and really trying to do something on their own. And there were over 100 living there over about 4 years, and some of us helped them with the water issues and hydro issues, and I remember, taking propane down on Saturday mornings. So I think out of that type of experience, I realized, the humanity of the, people that are really struggling even with addiction and mental health challenges. And out of that experience, John McKnight became, sort of a mentor in terms of what he was saying. And I'll just give one quote. John McKnight, who's a professor from Northwestern University, but often comes up here and is quite involved with Ryerson, says, "An emphasis on people's needs obscures people's abilities. There is a relentless struggle between associational ways and system ways. And what we have seen in our time is the ascendance of systems over associations. And we see how the systems of service often isolate people. People want to set down roots within a community and to feel to be their home." So going back to the basic income policy, which is what we're here to discuss today, it seems to me that there's three strategies that we have to keep in mind. Excuse me. And I think we need both short-term and long-term strategies. And the basic income itself, I think we really need, as Senator Hugh Segal pointed out, we really need to look at how welfare discourages work and discourages savings. And we need to do away with those rules. And we need some basic research on what the cost would be, even with the existing levels of welfare, social assistance and ODSP. Secondly, we have to look at the basic services, which includes medical, eyeglasses, dental, as well as access to childcare, housing, hydro, and in some cases transit. And third, I think we really need to look at the community sector. And we need a stronger community sector. I was on the International Year of Shelter for the Homeless in 1989, and there were over 800 nonprofit groups involved in creating housing. And a lot of these were church and synagogues that were doing housing. And a lot of that is, a lot of that resource has been wiped out over the last 15 years because of the housing policies of our provincial and federal governments in particular. So we really, if we had a strong community sector that was producing housing, then we wouldn't need as much housing subsidies or childcare subsidies. So that the money for basic services would be reduced a lot, and that money could go into a basic income program. I just want to look at give you some ideas on revenue sources. I was looking at my tax bills and my properties this week on a couple of commercial properties that I have, and noticing that the taxes have not gone up in the last 7 years. Did you know that taxes on many commercial properties have not increased in the last 7 years? And the reason is because the educational tax is being shifted from the commercial to the homeowners. But I think in this time of really low interest rates, it's, there's a real discrepancy here because commercial property owners, I'm talking more about the larger ones, the shopping center developers and office buildings, are making fortunes with these low interest rates, and they don't really need this decrease in property taxes. And so I think that's an area that we could look at as far as extra sources of income. You see a child care center closed down in the Scotiabank Plaza there, but at the same time, their taxes are being decreased because of these shifts. So I don't think a lot of people know about it. And as far as our income tax, I think, as far as a strategy, there are other areas that we should look at before we call for increases in income taxes. I think we've all been listening to Donald Trump and all the loopholes that he's found. So we know there's a lot of loopholes out there, and we should be doing research and looking at those. Also, business people generally have this real fear of increases in income taxes, but on the other hand, they really like incentives that will help them reduce their taxes. And we have to be really strong advocates to see that these incentives are directed at the type of social policies that we would like to see. And I give you an example is the capital gains tax for stocks. When it's transferred to a charity, they get a real tax incentive, and this is put $1 billion a year into charities. So this cost is split between the donor and the government, sort of on a 50-50 basis because of the tax advantages. And the same players that got that policy through 10 years ago are now calling for a gift tax for real estate and private shares. And this is expected to could put $400 million a year into charities. So again, we could say, well, we'll go along with that, but it's got to go into basic income policy, or it's got to go into housing and childcare, because we don't know where that $1 billion in capital gains incentives is going. there's a lot of worthwhile charities, but I got a card in my mail last week saying, from a big bank, saying, come to this reception and we'll show you how to set up your own charity, your own private charity. Well, that's all fine and good, but where's that money going to be used? Just a couple of other examples. There's Section 37 that the city has. It's put about $500 million into different programs, mostly public art, but Michael Vaughan and I see Joe Mahevick and Pam McConnell here. Others have helped get some of that money into affordable housing. And that's the type of advocacy that we need, is to move taxes into the areas that we're interested in. And then there's local currencies. Local currencies like the Toronto dollar are small, but the Toronto dollar generated $300,000 in income over 10 years in collaboration with the St. Lawrence Market merchants. And CRA doesn't see local currencies, it's not income, it's a gift. And the city agreed to not count it against income for people on social assistance. So we were able to, a lot of charities were able to give honorariums to their volunteers that they could use at local shops or at the market. And with electronic currencies today, it's something to look at, how we could use this tool. But just in general, as far as currencies, excuse me, I was looking at a Globe and Mail article recently, and it said the amount of money in circulation in the world today is 3 times what it was 8 years ago. That's a 300% increase in 8 years. And it said that the pension funds and institutions are, their words were, awash in liquid capital. So we've got this whole new money system, electronic money system, has a lot of velocity to it. And we need to understand it better and how it's affecting low-income people on low incomes. So I'm glad that Senator Hugh Segal and others are mentioning our faith, and I think we somehow need to take a lot stronger stand as people from faith communities. And I see that our people from indigenous traditions, from Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist traditions, are able to live out their faith through their social justice a lot more than people like myself from a Judeo-Christian background. And so I think we need to call ourselves to speak out more from our faith like we are doing today. And we have Old Testament prophets like Isaiah, who call us to loose the chains of injustice, to heal the brokenhearted, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked and free the prisoners. And somehow we have to learn how to preach that. And Jesus repeated these exact words of Isaiah in the synagogue, and also said that as much as you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do it to me. So somehow, we don't remember those words enough in our faith reflections, excuse me, and we need to bring out our traditions and our deeper motivations if we're going to call for change. One challenge, I think also we need to look at the cost-benefit analysis, because we know that if we had a basic income, it would really lead to a lot of other savings in other areas. And I think we have to be careful about the type of research that's done. There was a research done by the Mental Health Commission just 2 or 3 years ago that looked at a housing first policy. It was called At Home, but it cost $110 million to show this policy. And I think, we lose credibility with that type of cost being spent on research. I was speaking to Senator Eggleton here, Art Eggleton, just before, and I said, well, what did your study cost, Art, on the Toronto community housing, which listened to a presentation last week, and it's an excellent study. Cost $50,000. It involved a lot of volunteers and a lot of contributed research. So we do need research, but we don't want it to discredit what we're trying to do here. So Jim Rice from Sojourners magazine says that in this month's issue, I was noticing a quote where he said, change is going to come from a lot of areas, but the real common denominator is a collaboration of people like are in this room working together. And it's that type of participation that's really needed to achieve justice. So I could go on, but I know there's a lot of other people. I was going to maybe say more about the power of examples, how people learn through examples, and we really need more examples. We need these pilot studies, but I know there are a lot of speakers today. Evelyn Forget is going to speak about the success in Daphne, Manitoba. So it's interesting to see that the basic level of poverty back in 1974 was around $2,100, and the basic income was that was given was $100 a month. So we're a long ways from that, and probably because of all this inflation and this liquid money that's around in our world, we're dealing with a lot more challenge in trying to convince people of a basic income policy. But just the fact that welfare discourages work, it encourages cheating actually, and it discourages savings. We have some powerful arguments on our side that we really need to convince people about the dysfunctionality of the present system, and then share our vision, and I think we can go a long ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. As you can see, we've already started to introduce some challenging ideas. So I'll call next on Tim Hackborn. Coming up from the back.
So just to prove I believe in paperless, here are my notes today. So first, let me say is good morning, Segal, Ani, and as we've already acknowledged the First People, I also want to say is, as a First Nations person, welcome to the original gathering place here in Toronto on these lands. As expressed, my name is Tim Hackborn, and I am a member of the Onondaga Nation, Barefoot Clan from the Six Nations territory. Today I present myself to you as an urban Native man who has been raised in a Catholic school system, taken to an evangelical church by his mother, which ironically led me to Bible college. And then also I was taught the traditional ways of my grandfather, who was actually a mix of Onondaga and Tuscarora Nation. And my grandmother was Mohawk. And of course, as we all know about Mohawks, they're very strong personalities. In my limited years working, I have worked with the youth and children in both rural communities and here in the urban center, well known in Toronto, but other urban centers in Ontario. And since arriving here to the original gathering place of our First Nations people of Toronto, I have been actively involved in leadership roles in the social service sector, community development, and Christian churches. And when I say Christian churches, it's Anglicans and a lot of evangelical churches over the years. But most recently, my role at Metropolitan United Church, I am a senior layperson in that community. But most importantly for me is I have been an active leader in my community for 13 years as a board member at Anishinaabe Homes, which is a growing housing agency in Toronto. And we have grown from 13 homes to, which at that time was a total of like 22 units, 26 units, to now we're over 130 units. And so with my fellow board members, it has been a journey. First, as a member of the First Nations community, allow me to acknowledge the current climate in Ontario and Canada in which we are in today. Many Canadians are just beginning to learn about the tragedies that have happened and the various First Nations people that was highlighted by the Honourable Senator Murray Sinclair and the TRC. In his report, I skipped my notes. in his report on behalf of the TRC, while I'm not going to divulge in the numerous implications that have been brought forward by the TRC, I believe it is important to discuss a few points that have had a significant impact on First Nations. For Canadians to understand the complexity of our relationship, which was started as a treaty relationship nation to nation, we must acknowledge the uniqueness of how our tumultuous past has created a unique perspective on how we see each other, a perspective that is very different from other Canadians, newcomers, or to recognize the true nature of multicultural Canada, newer settlers. This relationship with the settlers of Canada was first established with each First Nation. As we all know today, our relationship has continued to be a treaty relationship, even with the formation of the Confederation that soon brought the birth of the Indian Act, and which has had a long impact on our relationship between our peoples. Today, the Indian Act continues to represent the interests of the settlers, and it maintains an administrative power over First Nations people, their lands, and is the only legislation of this nature that remains despite the obvious inequalities. While the municipalities are able to generate revenue tools based upon property tax, First Nations people are unable to own land on their reserves. Therefore, limiting the councils of these First Nations communities to use those same revenue tools. While there have been some recent improvement in parts of the province, historically First Nations people could not gain the significant financing to support their economic development. And the only time significant investment that happened is when government signed on as partners and benefactors of the selling of land rights, in which case there was less money for First Nations people. In the Act, in fact, federal government would at times consider money transfer from such deals as part of the regular funding transfers, leaving the First Nations reserve with no more money than what they had started out in the beginning of the deal. The inability to have private money on reserves had a natural impact on other infrastructures such as housing and energy, as a couple of examples. It is important to highlight these facts and events to present a perspective and the reason to the nature of the power imbalance that not only affects First Nations people directly, but has influenced how the province of Ontario has maintained its relationship with First Nations. In 1965, the province of Ontario and the federal government signed an agreement which was seen as progressive and yet was refused by every other province in Canada. The agreement was called the Welfare Agreement. And just to be clear, is that the Welfare Agreement was not just for social assistance for Ontario Works as we see today, but it had 4 key areas for child and youth, health, and I forget what the 4th one is off the top of my head, but it was a key part, and it's still active very much today in how the province of Ontario manages Ontario Works on the rural communities. So as part of this deal, the federal government is required to reimburse the province 93 cents for every dollar that's spent on a reserve. And while this agreement provided money for welfare services, it also identified that First Nations could administrate the money and services on their lands. And I must say that this was done without any First Nations at the table. The agreement did not include any capital or development monies, and therefore those costs had to be paid by the First Nations. So today when you go to Initiative Nation, they invested their own money to establish their administrative capacity to do the programs and services that they have there. Over the decades, the federal government has put caps and restrictions on the reimbursement to the province despite the agreement. And while the province has paid and continues to pay also the restrictions, and so as a result of these restrictions, the province passed down those deficits to the First Nations, who then themselves had to absorb those differences. And while the province has paid and continues to pay for 50% of the cost with municipalities, with many decades of no funding on the reserves, it has impeded their ability to establish welfare service, included child protection, health, education, development that were established in the agreement. Today, we see how those systemic issues have emerged. And they're still represented today here in the City of Toronto in the social services in which First Nations are overrepresented by 5 to 10 times more than any other Canadian settler group. This year, the province has announced $222 million investment over 3 years to be invested in health services on First Nations. And while I acknowledge that this is a positive shift in funding investment, it is a pale comparison to the $11 billion committed to Humber River over the next 10 years. Per year, this means Ontario is investing $74 million to First Nations across the province, and it's invested $1.1 billion per year to Humber River Hospital. In sharing this information with you, I do need to also acknowledge that welfare agreement that was established between the province and the federal government is the only First Nations people is only for the First people living on their respective reserves. In the urban centers, we are commonly identified today as urban Native people. First Nations people such as myself are considered to be part of the regular Canadian population when we live off a reserve. Not only do we lose almost all of our rights, many of us, the journey for many of us to establish personal stability begins much further behind than other Canadians. And when you consider that many of us arrive with significant disadvantages, there are a result of the systemic issues that are created by the past policies that I have just identified. Today, we are here to discuss guaranteed income and the importance of principles of human dignity, mutual respect, and security. I was pleased to hear the apology from the Honourable Kathleen Wynne, Premier of Ontario, and the Ontario Legislature, and to hear her commitment to the cause of action. While this pivotal moment is a new beginning between the province and the First Nations people within Ontario, we will have work to do on both sides. It's important from human dignity which can only move forward when equality and the right to self-determination is recognized. Mutual respect can be achieved when we understand each other. When First Nations people living in settler country, it means to share their story again. For the settlers, it's to listen to people of the First Nations and understand that each First Nation is different, unique, spiritually unique, and culturally unique. Also to be acknowledged as treaty nations. Each nation that is sovereign and has a spiritual connection to Turtle Island, the land which is the founding source to our spirituality. And security can only be achieved when we work as partners. By doing the work locally together to bring equality and stability of First Nations people in rural and urban centers within this province. Together as partners, we can advocate the same meaningful change with our federal partner, the Canadian government, to support and build upon our work. Our elders teach us about the importance of keeping our commitments to the land, the water, plants, and the animals. Our spiritual life is evidenced by the relationship that these commitments are practiced in our ceremonies and our laws, which are passed from generation to generation through the oral traditions. And along with these traditions, there is a holistic approach to how we learn, and that is lived out from day to day. To provide insight, I want to share a personal story of how my grandmother taught me about patience and leadership. When I was 6 years old, My grandfather and I were sitting in the living room of my grandparents' house, which was built on a patch of land that had a large front yard, and it was about 2 acres long, and it was bordered by intersecting roads. On the other side was a garden and 2 large swamps that ran down either side. It stretched from the house and it ran to the connecting property, which was, oddly enough, our cousin's place. Obviously, there was a lot of run back and forth over time, but on that particular Saturday, we were watching cartoons all morning. We being my brother, my cousins. My grandfather decided we needed to go outside and play. However, it was cold and raining, and so our grandmother, or Gram as we called her, immediately interjected and said, "Leave those kids alone." This inspired some rather colorful discourse, and once in the end we were sent to the bedroom to play. I was the youngest, so therefore I would be excluded by my older brother and my cousins during playtimes. So I decided I had enough that day of being ignored and threw a punch at my brother. After the usual discourse and the intervention of Graham, I was forced to sit on the couch with my grandfather watching a fishing show. After a few minutes, I tried to convince him to change the channel to cartoons by whining and complaining. To my surprise, my grandfather stood up and turned off the TV and ordered me to get dressed to go outside. Well, when I tried to express the unfairness of having to be the only one to go outside, surprisingly, my gram came over and smacked me behind the head and said, "Do what you're told." And so with no allies or friends left to help me, I reluctantly obeyed, and I watched my grandfather get dressed himself. Past experiences only told me that if Gramps was getting out, that only meant work. So I was even more eager to stay inside. However, I moved quickly when I saw Gram start looking in the drawer for that wooden spoon she often threatened to hit us with. Though she never did hit us with it, I was not going to take the chance and end up being the first. So when I got outside, my grandfather was holding 2 guns. One which he passed to me, and it was a small caliber .22, and it was red-brown, and could only shoot 1 bullet at a time. And we walked for what seemed a long time in the cold rain. In an early winter, and through the forest, along the trails, and it took us past several swamps. And until we came to the road, and when we first stepped out of the bush, there was a bridge overpass with a river flowing underneath that was full of fish trying to swim upstream. At this point, my grandfather reminded me the rules about holding a gun, and all the responsibilities that goes with holding the gun. I asked him, "Well, why are we here?" His response was simple: "For you to learn how to shoot." And so that late afternoon, my grandfather taught me how to aim and shoot by shooting fish in that creek. And after a period of time, other people stopped to watch the lesson. And on the side of the road in cold, wet weather, I experienced one of the best memories of my life. They laughed at me trying to shoot and also cheered for me when I finally hit a fish. Later, my grandfather told me that the creek was too full of fish, and that year, with that many fish would have died for this spring. And all these fish were all bumped against each other, unable to change their environment, stuck in the cold water. However, as people, we can change our environments. In the way that I was forced to leave the house, most importantly, he showed me that we can change our perception of our environment. In the way that my experience changed on the side of that cold day on the side of the road. When it comes to discussions of today, I would encourage all of you to look beyond the common perceptions and hear the voices that resonate with each speaker. As a leader of Metropolitan United Church, I have been fascinated by the long history of this church community that has helped build some of Toronto's social service structure. It has been and continues to be involved in the development of social policies that affect the vulnerable people within Toronto. Along with Metropolitan, other church communities at St. Michael's Cathedral, St. James Cathedral, St. Andrew's Presbyterian, the Sisters of St. Joseph. They came together about almost a year ago now, and as I look upon Andrew, it's been almost a year. And we formed a faith-based community hub. And along with that relationship with St. Michael's Hospital and the Community Development Program at Ryerson University. This hub is reflective of the continuous commitment and the work with the vulnerable people that our faith community provides. These commitments have also been taken on by many of our other faith representatives that are here today. And so with that, I want to say thank you. Now,